On June 14th, 1888, when the noon heat in Sage Hollow reached 91 degrees and the creek ran low enough for stones to show their backs above the current, the settlement still moved as if water were a certainty ordained by geography. There were 312 souls in that Wyoming Territory basin, most of them within a short walk of the general store, and nearly every one of them believed the same shallow channel that had welcomed their wagons would continue to feed their stock, gardens, wash kettles, and pride. The wind carried alkali dust down Main Street in pale ribbons. Mules stamped beside hitch rails worn smooth by years of trade, and the plank sign over Crowley Mercantile swung and knocked in a rhythm like a slow hammer. Up above town, on a narrow bench of hard clay and broken stone that no rancher had bid for at county sale, Shane Preston measured ground with a survey rope, marked circles with ash, and began work that most of Sage Hollow would spend 2 years calling foolishness. Shane was 28 that summer, broad-shouldered from hoe and shovel work, with wrists marked by old twine burns and a face browned and wind-cut by high country weather. She had come west from the Kansas line with 2 trunks, 1 mule, a crate of tools wrapped in oiled canvas, and a discipline that had been taught as plainly as prayer. Her mother, Rebecca Preston, had been a farmer's daughter and then a farmer's wife in a county that knew grasshopper years and lean winters, and she had taught survival as arithmetic rather than hope. How many jars of beans for 6 cold months? How many pounds of salt for a hog? How many days a family could stretch flour if the mill wheel stopped? Her father, Amos Preston, had spoken less often, but when he spoke he put weight behind each word, and Shane had heard him say through 3 failed Augusts, "Water fails before men admit it. Pride dies thirsty first." Those lessons had not been offered as philosophy. They had been paid for in labor and in loss. In 1874, when Shane was 14, drought had cracked the Kansas fields into hard plates and turned 2 neighboring homesteads into abandoned frames. Her mother had kept their household through that season by counting every pail, covering every barrel, and setting aside seed grain, while others ground theirs for bread. 2 years later, fever had taken Rebecca in 11 days, and the work of preserving, rationing, and recording had passed without ceremony to Shane's hands. Amos had lasted until the spring thaw of 1883, then died after a wagon accident on a flooded crossing, leaving his daughter a ledger book, 3 iron-bound sayings, and enough cash to begin again if she chose land no one else wanted. She chose Sage Hollow because it sat where others saw convenience, and she saw risk. The place had 1 creek, 1 store, 1 church, and 1 route in for freight most months of the year. Such simplicity gave comfort in ordinary weather and danger in hard seasons. The town stood 12 years old in 1888, built first by teamsters and then by miners and cattlemen, with frame houses in the center and sod roofs farther out where cash thinned. Elias Crowley had risen with it. He was 46, thick through chest and belly from prosperous years, with polished boots, starched shirts imported from Denver twice a year, and a silver watch chain that flashed when he leaned from his porch to greet customers. He owned the largest store, carried most notes of credit, and chaired enough meetings that his opinion often reached the status of rule before anyone named it so. He had a practical intelligence for commerce and an unshaken faith in abundance, and those twin habits made him respected in good times and dangerous in uncertain ones. Shane did not arrive with speeches. She bought the stony acre above town for $18 in county script, signed the deed at the clerk's table, and spent her first month cutting brush, setting fence posts, and testing the soil with a hand auger. The bench was narrow, but beneath the first crust lay heavy clay that held moisture rather than shedding it. Rainwater from the slope above crossed that patch in thin sheets after storms, and lingered in shallow seams where roots stayed damp, days longer than on the flats below. That was enough. She built a one-room board house, dug a cool room into the north bank, and planted beans, squash, and late potatoes in furrows laid by string line, then began keeping records on foolscap paper, rainfall by storm, seep depth by trench, and daily draw estimates for one adult, one child, one mule. By late July, when evening light turned the hills copper and the town relaxed after branding season, Shane had drawn the first full plan for a lined cistern 14 feet deep and 18 feet across, with an inner collar for a cedar-lidded shaft and a runoff trench angled from the upper wash. She calculated the cost at $146 if she did most of the labor herself, $61 for lime and ash by wagon lot, $24 for cedar planks and lid braces, $19 for iron fittings and 2 gate valves, $11 for rope and pulley hardware, and the remainder for nails, pitch, and replacement tools. Stone would come from the ridge in sled loads hauled by mule because paying quarry rates would have doubled the estimate. When Crowley heard of the dimensions, he laughed openly from his porch, while 3 ranch hands waited for grain sacks and a schoolteacher priced slates beside the counter. "Preston is digging a monument to fear," he said, loud enough for the boardwalk and hitch rail both. "Call it Preston's Folly and be done with it." The name spread before sundown, carried in wagon talk, in kitchen remarks, and in that particular tone, frontier settlements reserved for anyone who worked against custom. Ridicule had low cost and quick profit. It required no shovel. Shane answered none of it in public. She set stakes at the planned perimeter, checked level with a water tube and marked pole, and began excavation at first light each day. The top 2 feet came out in brittle clods and loose stone. Below that, the clay tightened and had to be cut with mattock and narrow spade, then hauled up by bucket sling. She worked alone except for a hired teamster twice each month, paying $1.25 a day to move heavier spoil and bring sandstone from the ridge cut. At 10 feet, she began setting the outer ring. Hand-cut blocks, each roughly 14 inches long and 6 inches thick, bedded in a lime ash mortar mixed 3-to-1 in a pit lined with scrap plank. Every 4th course, she laid a tie stone clear through the wall for bond strength. By the end of August, the ring stood waist-high above grade, and the work had acquired the look of permanence that taunts doubters without speaking to them. There were practical reasons for each measure, and Shane explained them only when asked directly. Evaporation would strip an open pit faster than any careful household could spare, so the access opening would be capped in cedar, tarred at seams, and weighted with an iron strap latch. Sediment would cloud the draw and foul barrels, so she set a first silt trap uphill, shallow and broad, to catch wash before water entered the main chamber. Overflow would ruin the wall base in cloudburst weather, so she cut a side spill trench and lined it with flat rock pitched away from the foundation. She measured trough line grade by rope knots and plumb bob, 1 knot to each yard, to ensure steady gravity flow without standing pockets where water might sour. Her ledger listed all of it in plain script, with dates, costs, and corrections entered in red, where early assumptions failed. The town saw labor and called it obsession. Children were warned away from the site, not because danger was unusual on frontier works, but because parents had no wish for questions at supper about why preparation resembled fear. Invitations to Sunday dinners thinned, then ceased. Crowley, who sold most hardware in Sage Hollow, refused to bargain on bulk purchase and later charged Shane 30% above his own posted rate for keg nails and strap hinges, saying freight had grown dear, though his shelves remained full that week. She paid and marked the overcharge in her book without comment. The mule hauled another load. The wall rose another course. In the final week of August 1888, under a sky clear enough to make distance look kind, Shane fitted the first cedar braces for the lid frame and set 2 temporary barrels at the inflow trench to test sediment drop in a controlled run. The bench above Sage Hollow held heat through dusk, and from that height she could see lamps kindling one by one in town, each flame a household trusting tomorrow to resemble yesterday. She looked once toward the creek, now narrower than in June, though few had remarked on it, then returned to the mortar pit and mixed the next batch to proper thickness. Work first, warning later. By dawn, the mortar from that last batch had skinned hard in the pan, and a dry east wind came down off the ridge carrying dust fine enough to settle in the crease of every tool handle. Shane rose before full light, drew 2 buckets from the temporary seep trench, and held each against the sky to judge suspended grit before pouring them through folded muslin into a marked barrel. The measured loss was 1 1/4 quarts to sediment in 10 gallons, higher than she had projected for late summer runoff, and she wrote the correction in her ledger with a sharpened carpenter pencil. Increase first trap volume by 1/3 before winter set. She worked through the morning on the inner collar stones, setting each by plumb line and checking the curve with a willow template she had bent and dried for that purpose. At noon, with the bench heat climbing and the air at 94 degrees in shade, she paused only long enough to eat cold beans, then hitched the mule and went down to Crowley Mercantile for lime and 2 lengths of iron strap. The store porch was crowded with teamsters waiting on credit notes, and Elias Crowley stood at the doorway in a cream vest that showed no dust despite the street, his watch chain bright against the cloth. He looked at the order slate in her hand and smiled without warmth. "Still feeding that stone throat, Miss Preston? You will have the deepest empty hole in Wyoming territory." Shane set the slate on the counter. 2 lime sacks, 80 pounds each. Strap iron, 1 inch width, 12 feet total. I pay cash. Crowley tapped the posted price board with 1 finger, then named a higher figure by 13 cents on the dollar. "Freight trouble out of Cheyenne. Scarcity reaches all of us." She watched him long enough for the men by the flour barrels to fall quiet. "Your freight invoice from last week is pinned behind your till." Rates did not change. She laid exact coin down anyway, because the work required materials more than victory. "Write the true amount in your own hand. I keep records." A ranch hand laughed and said, "Preston keeps books for a drought that has not arrived." Crowley took that line and shaped it for the room. "A town does not kneel to a jar-keeper's fear." The phrase moved through the store like a thrown pebble through geese, abrupt and noisy, then settled as agreement. Shane lifted the lime sacks without asking for help, balanced one across each side of the mule sled, and led the animal back uphill with the straps tied under the traces. She did not answer anyone on the boardwalk. Her silence carried farther than argument. By the first week of September, she had finished the cedar lid frame and test-fit the iron braces across the access shaft, leaving only tar sealing and hinge pinning before final closure. On September the 3rd, 1888, a survey crew from the Territorial Water Office rode into Sage Hollow with measuring rods, inked maps, and a clerk who read figures aloud in front of the church steps. They had rechecked creek marks set over 10 years at 3 bends above town and found late summer flow down by nearly half against prior averages. At the lower crossing, where children had fished minnows in June, depth at noon now measured 9 inches where the decade mean had been 17. Some towns had treated such numbers as warning. Sage Hollow treated them as inconvenience. Crowley said the marks were taken in an odd year, and that odd years passed. A school teacher suggested that one dry month proved little in a territory known for swings. 2 ranchers insisted autumn storms would mend what summer had thinned. Shane asked the clerk for a copy of the sheet and paid 25 cents for the duplicate, then walked to the church where an evening gathering had already begun, around lantern light and hymn books. She stood at the side aisle, hat in both hands, and waited for speaking room. When Pastor Eli Turner nodded, she laid the survey sheet flat on a pew and spoke in the same tone she used for costs and measurements. If flow has dropped this far before winter, then spring will not save us unless snowpack rises beyond ordinary. We can set storage now. Catchment ditches from roof lines, covered borels by household, ration ledgers posted by family size, shared reserve under lock and tally. A murmur moved through the benches, not angry at first, only resistant in the way settled habits resist new accounting. Crowley rose from the second row, broad as a doorway, hat brim in hand for the room to see his courtesy, while he dismissed the plan. Shane Preston sees famine in every cloud. If we begin counting cups in September, we will frighten children and choke trade before frost. We are not beggars crouching over jars. He turned to the congregation and spread one hand toward the windows where evening still held heat. A town this strong does not take orders from a private pit on a hillside. There was laughter then, brief and relieved, because relief is often purchased by following the loudest man. Pastor Turner called for calm, said prudence had value, and deferred any decision to a committee that never met. Shane folded the survey sheet, returned it to her satchel, and walked home under a moon thin as scraped bone. She did not stop at any porch. She measured distance by footfall and kept going uphill. In the weeks that followed, she altered the plan from solitary storage to system capacity. The original wall thickness at the upper courses had been 16 inches, adequate for ordinary load if kept dry. She broke out 3 full rings of set stone, cleaned the blocks, and rebuilt to 20 inches with through stones at shorter intervals, so the chamber would resist both heat stress and ground shift. The labor cost was punishing. The gain was structural certainty. She wrote both facts in red. She also began the second basin above the main cistern, a settling pond 12 feet by 8 and 4 feet deep, lined with clay and stone chips, shaped to slow inflow and drop suspended sand before water reached the chamber mouth. Its spill lip sat 6 inches below the main intake grade, forcing overflow outward into a gravel fan rather than toward the wall footings. She carved measurement marks on a cedar staff at half-inch increments and drove it at the basin edge to track storm capture through winter. For roofing catchment, she bargained with a sawyer for warped plank lots at reduced rate, paying $6.40 for timber others had rejected, then planned each board true enough to shed runoff into a gutter line sealed with boiled pitch and horsehair fiber. Her ledger from October through December became a technical text written under weather pressure. Lime ratio adjusted to 3 1/2 to 1 after a cold snap slowed cure. Iron latch remade with wider eye because first pin seized under dust. Muslin filters changed from single fold to double after wind events above 20 miles an hour. Seep loss estimate revised by household category. Adult laborers at 3 gallons daily minimum in heat. Children at 1 1/2 with strict reuse protocols for wash water. Beside those entries, she kept a parallel table of food reserves in the cool room. 32 jars beans, 21 jars squash, 14 crocks salt pork, dried apple slices by pound, vinegar by jug, and coarse salt by sack. She rotated stock by date and marked spoilage without excuse. On January 12, 1889, a warm Chinook rolled over Sage Hollow so quickly that frost lifted from wagon hubs before breakfast, and men worked in shirt sleeves by noon. Snow that had lain thin across the flats vanished into black mud in 2 days. Children ran along Main Street without mittens, and more than one household declared winter broken early. Crowley set out seed catalogs near his front counter and extended spring credit to nearly any signature. Shane watched the meltwater race shallow over frozen subsoil and disappear downslope by evening, leaving little recharge in the ground that mattered. She added 2 new columns to her book, one for false thaw events and one for retained moisture 3 days later, then moved to full winter labor despite the town's easy mood. She raised the cistern parapet another course, tar-sealed the cedar lid seams, and wrapped the upper pipe section in wool scrap under canvas against freeze-thaw cracking. She began a narrow trench to connect the second basin through a screened throat, fitting a removable grate of iron rods, space to stop leaves and vermin while allowing storm flow. The work drew fresh ridicule because it contradicted the weather in front of everyone's eyes. At the store porch, Crowley called down to passing teamsters. "Preston builds for a blizzard in spring and a drought in snowmelt. The only thing filling in that hole is Preston's loneliness. He said it often enough that children repeated it with no malice, as children repeat whatever adults reward." 2 boys sang it once near her gate until she handed each a shovel and told them to clear the spill trench if they wished to use breath there. They left before finishing 10 feet. Exclusion hardened in quieter forms. Sunday invitations stopped entirely that winter. A widow who had traded canning wax with Shane for months sent word that her brother objected to alarm talk and requested distance. A carpenter who had promised discounted hinge work withdrew the offer after Crowley declined his credit renewal. None of it changed the stone. None of it moved the grade stakes. Shane kept hiring day labor when needed, paying fair coin to men willing to work without commentary, and dismissed any who mocked on the line because distraction wasted material. On March 22, 1889, when wagon wheels cut dust from roads that should have held spring damp, she climbed to the ridge at first light to check runoff channels and found them dry before noon. She returned, filled the silt trap from 2 stored barrels to test gate valves under low-head conditions, and timed draw rates by minute glass. 2 gallons and 1 pint per minute at full open, 1 gallon at half, steady enough for rationing if lines were disciplined. She painted those rates on a board and hung it by the gate, though few read it. That evening, with wind pressing steady from the southwest and lamps beginning to burn in town below, she stood by the new basin and spoke to the mule while tightening a trace buckle. Let them talk. Words do not keep out the wind. Then she lifted another stone from the sled, set it on the mortar bed, and pressed until the joint squeezed clean and narrow, exactly as her mother had taught for jars, for walls, for any vessel meant to carry a family through a season that others still refused to count. She left that stone where it was, wiped mortar from her palms with a rag stiff from lime, and checked the lid latch twice before walking to the cool room cut into the north bank. Inside, the air held at 53 degrees by her wall thermometer, cold enough to guard food in summer heat and warm enough to prevent freezing in winter, and she shifted 6 bean jars from the rear shelf to the front so no lot sat past its date. Each jar carried a paper label with month and day. Each shelf had a chalk mark for target count, and each target traced back to a ledger line calculated against 312 souls, though she did not yet name that larger purpose in town. By lantern light, she entered the day's labor in careful script. 16 stones set, 2 rejected for hairline fractures, 1/2 sack lime consumed, 1 trace buckle mended, lid seal inspected and sound. By the second week of April 1889, she had begun the outer catchment apron, a sloped ring of tamped clay and flat stone, extending 9 feet beyond the cistern wall on the uphill side, and 6 feet on the lower side, pitched at 1 inch per foot toward a feeder trench lined with gravel and woven willow mat. The apron did not appear grand. It looked to hurried eyes like a woman spreading yard work across barren ground. Yet, in every heavy rain, it would become a collector, guiding runoff into the settling basin instead of letting it braid into waste gullies. She bought 2 more cedar beams from a freight wagon out of Laramie at $2.10 each, paid in cash at the hitch rail to avoid Crowley's markup, and cut them into gateposts for a measured draw point where bucket lines could form in order. Her methods grew more exact as the system grew larger. She bored a sight tube into the cistern wall at shoulder height and mounted a float rod inside, so water depth could be read from outside without opening the lid and surrendering cool air. She forged numbered tin tags for households, punched at her own anvil in the shed, 1 through 68, then half tags for single laborers lodging in bunkhouses. She tarred the underside of the cedar lid once in May and again in June, allowing 3 full days of curing between coats, and she tested for leaks with flour dust laid around the seam. Where moisture rose, the dust caked, and she resealed. On mornings when wind moved grit like smoke across the bench, she covered the intake screen with doubled muslin and changed cloth at noon and dusk. Waste was measured. Cleanliness was measured. Time itself was measured, because neglect in 1 hour multiplied into scarcity in the next month. Crowley watched all of it from below and altered his strategy from laughter to leverage. At a town committee meeting in late May, held in the back room of his store where he kept the account books and the better chairs, he argued that private storage above town created a fire and health hazard unless subject to inspection fees for public safety. The motion passed by 4 votes to 1. Shane received notice on a folded sheet with a red stamp and a demand for $9 annual review, payable before any future expansion. She walked to the store the next morning, set the notice flat on the counter, and asked who had inspected Crowley's own grain cellar for rats, mold, and tinder dust. He said the comparison was impertinent. She paid the $9, requested a signed receipt, and took with her 2 witnesses from the line so that no one could later deny the terms under which she had complied. The fee did not slow the work, but the social edge sharpened. Families who once traded seed with her at fair rate now sent children with exact coin and no greetings. Church suppers posted names for pie tables and lamp duties, and hers was absent each month even when she arrived early with provisions. At the schoolhouse, one mother complained that Cistern talk frightened the younger pupils, and the teacher asked that water ledgers remain outside lessons unless requested by parents. Crowley repeated from his porch that fear was a contagion and that commerce required confidence, then sold decorative pumps and painted rain barrels at premium prices to households that had no lids for either. Men laughed when they said Preston's folly. Women lowered their voices when they said it. The effect was the same. By August 1889, Sage Hollow had entered its 13th year, and the census slate in the church vestibule counted 319 souls after spring arrivals. Shane adjusted every ratio in her books. She expanded the cool room by 4 feet, shored the cut with rough cedar studs at 20-inch spacing, and laid a stone floor over packed sand to keep crocs off damp earth. She purchased coarse salt in bulk from a passing trader, 180 pounds at 3 cents per pound, then divided it into sealed tins marked for meat, pickling, and emergency broth. She hung dried squash strips from willow rods, smoked pork over low applewood heat for 2 days at a time, and rotated vinegar stocks so none turned. Nothing in that room was accidental. Even the spacing between shelves, 11 inches for jars and 16 for crocks, came from repeated trial against breakage and reach in low light. In early October, she set a second gate below the basin, not for ordinary use, but for controlled flushing after dust storms, and she drilled 3 apprentice tasks into her own routine, as if unseen helpers were already present. Open, count, close, record, verify, post, clean, dry, rehang. When she needed extra hands to raise a beam or reset trench stone, she hired day labor from passing freight crews and paid the same $1.25 she had paid the year before, plus supper. She asked no man to trust her forecast. She asked only for square cuts and full hours. Most gave both. A few left after hearing jokes in town. She replaced them and continued. Winter of 1889 came with little snow and long intervals of bare ground. On January 6, 1890, the morning low in Sage Hollow stood at 12 degrees, yet by afternoon the sun pulled warmth from south-facing slopes and the creek edges went soft without gaining depth. Shane rode upstream with a measuring rod, marked 3 bends against prior notes, and found undercut banks where steady flow had once run. She copied figures that evening by lamplight and carried them, along with a proposal for shared storage rules, to Pastor Eli Turner and the 2 deacons who handled relief funds. Turner listened in earnest silence. One deacon nodded and said the data were serious. The other said a public appeal might injure business in planting season. No schedule was set. The papers were placed in a drawer. She returned uphill and drove fence staples until dark. By the 3rd week of February 1890, Crowley introduced a new practice that dressed exclusion as order. Any household buying on credit at his store had to sign a clause pledging first payment on account before private reserve purchases, a phrase broad enough to include bulk jars, spare lids, pipe, and salt. Families already in debt could not risk refusal. They bought what he stocked and postponed what Shane had urged. He told them this protected fair circulation. In effect, it tied preparation to his ledger. When a ranch wife asked for 50 extra jars and lids, he sold her 12 and said supply was uncertain, then mocked from the porch that Preston's folly now seeks disciples. The line traveled quickly. Even those who doubted him repeated it to avoid standing apart. Shane answered as she had answered from the first day. By building systems no insult could unbuild. She posted a public chalkboard at her gate listing barrel hygiene steps, boil times by altitude estimate, and daily draw limits for adults, children, stock, and garden starts. Anyone could read it. Anyone could copy it. She offered Sunday instruction on filter cloth stitching and lid sealing, and for 4 weeks no one came. On the 5th week, an elderly widower attended, asked 3 precise questions, and left with a folded page of notes. The following Sunday, 2 ranch daughters arrived with a broken valve and learned how to seat leather washers. Their father did not thank her in public, yet his roof gained a gutter before spring rain. Change began where pride could hide it. By May 1890, the warning signs stood in plain country as if written in broad chalk. Geese crossed north 2 weeks earlier than any date in Pastor Turner's almanac margins. Cottonwoods along the lower bank dropped leaves in midsummer heat, while branches still held green tips, a stress she'd seen only in severe moisture deficit. Frogs disappeared from 3 homestead wells east of town, not 1 or 2 missing by chance, but entire evening choruses gone silent. Stock-nosed dry mud where seep channels had run the previous June. At dawn, dust devils lifted from creek flats before breakfast, a pattern old teamsters called a bad summer's herald. Shane marked each sign with date, place, and corroborating witness when one existed, then pinned a summary sheet on the church notice board under the hymn list. The sheet remained for 1 day. By evening, someone had torn off the lower half where she had listed probable drawdown timelines and household minimums. Crowley said at the store that migratory birds proved nothing, and that tree blight had many causes. A school committee member suggested frogs shifted habitats naturally. A ranch foreman argued that a single thunderstorm could reverse all concerns in one righteous night. Men nodded because that prospect required no change of habit. Women listened and looked away. The town spent $74 repainting the hotel porch rail in June, while Shane spent the same month installing shade screens over her trough line and repairing the basin lip after a wind event that moved half the gravel fan. On July 2nd, 1890, with the afternoon heat at 101 degrees and no measurable rain for 21 days, she walked the full creek length through town and counted disconnected pools where current had been continuous in prior summers. At Crowley's private well, long advertised as bottomless, two boys drew up a bucket of cloudy water from 9 feet and struck mud at 11 when they lowered the line again. The boys carried that report to Main Street, and by supper every porch in Sage Hollow discussed it in lowered voices. Crowley declared the rope had snagged and ordered a new line. Shane said nothing from her bench. She cleaned the intake screen, checked the float rod at 2 inches below the June mark, and set out an extra slate beside the gate. On the 16th of July, one day before the heat forecast posted by the survey clerk, she repainted numbers on each household tag and added a column for age on her tally board, because children and elders failed fastest under ration strain. She cut fresh chalk, stacked spare ladles, and placed a wash basin at the gate so hands could be cleaned before touching shared handles. As twilight settled over Sage Hollow, the town below sounded thinner than usual. Fewer songs on porches, fewer card games from the hotel yard, more footsteps to and from dry pumps. Shane latched the cedar lid, looked once toward the creek trench darkening in the last light, and left the gate unbarred. At first light on July 17, 1890, he'd already stood at 82 degrees on the shaded wall of Shane Preston's shed, and by 9 o'clock, the creek through Sage Hollow had ceased to run in any visible line, broken instead into shallow basins that reflected the sky like scraps of tin. Men walked into the channel with shovels and cut quick sumps where the mud still shone, but each pit filled once with cloudy seep and then settled to a pace that clung to bucket bottoms. The sound that morning was not water. It was scraping iron, coughing stock, and the thin slap of empty pails against trouser legs. Shane opened the gate at sunrise and chalked the first draw schedule across the board. Households 1 through 12 by half-hour interval, 2 gallons per adult, 1 1/2 per child. Elders to be served first when family tags included age marks in red. She set the wash basin where all could reach it, laid out cloth filters, and stood beside the tally slate, while the first line formed in uncertain silence. Those who had laughed loudest did not meet her eyes. She did not ask for apology. She asked for tag numbers and vessel count, then measured each draw with a marked dipper before any bucket touched the trough. By noon, the temperature at Crowley Mercantile Porch read 101. By 2, it touched 104. That number held for the next 9 days, and hot wind arrived each afternoon from the south, carrying grit that entered every uncovered barrel in town and turned cooling cloths brown within an hour. Roof catchments built in haste with loose seams failed first. What little dew they gathered leaked down walls before reaching storage. Shallow private wells dropped foot by foot and then gave only damp rope. The painted pumps Crowley had sold that spring stood like ornaments over dry shafts, their handles rising and falling with a hollow iron knock that no longer promised anything below. On July 18th, the committee that had once debated inspection fees for Shane's cistern met again in Crowley's back room and produced 3 pages of emergency rules none of them could enforce because they had no shared source to govern. 2 ranchers argued for armed guards at private wells that were already exhausted. A hotel owner demanded first claim for paying guests. Pastor Eli Turner asked that all households report their remaining barrels by nightfall. Fewer than half replied, and many figures were guesses offered from pride. The paper authority of Sage Hollow outlasted the water by only 1 day. By July 19th, Crowley's own well team had lowered line to 13 feet and struck dry chalk. He ordered 2 hired men to deepen the shaft by lantern in the dawn hours, paying $2 a day each and double rations. Yet the spoil they raised was powder and stone. No damp seam, no dark smell of groundwater, Nothing. Word traveled up the hill before breakfast, and when it reached Shane, she erased one line on the board and wrote another beneath the schedule. No household exempt, including store accounts and committee chairs. She underlined exempt once, then went back to measuring. The disaster widened by systems, not by drama. Cisterns built for cellar convenience soured because lids had never fit tight. Meat spoiled on hooks where families had no salt reserve. Gardens planted from Crowley's spring seed, credit burned at the edges, then collapsed to brittle stalks that gave no return against debt. Mule teams sent to distant draws came back late and half-loaded, having found only contested pools guarded by men from other settlements with the same need and the same fear. Freight from Cheyenne failed to arrive the week promised, and then the week after as wagon masters rerouted toward larger towns that could pay cash on delivery. In Sage Hollow, scarcity was no longer prediction or argument. It was arithmetic visible in every pan. 3 days passed before the first death, and in that brief interval Shane expanded operations from drawpoint to town system with a discipline that replaced panic where it could. She posted 2 night watches at the gate, one from dusk to midnight and one from midnight to dawn, each watch given a lantern, a whistle, and strict orders. No private draw without tally, no open container near the shaft, no exception for rank. She moved broth service to evening so laborers returned from failed wells could drink salt and vinegar before collapse. She assigned rinse water reuse by household to reduce waste at wash tubs, and she taught children to tie filter cloth so adults did not waste clean muslin by wringing it barehanded in dust. The routines were simple. Their effect was profound. Within 2 days, line discipline replaced shoving, and the nightly arguments outside the gate thinned into quiet waiting. On July 21st, Daniel Crow, the blacksmith whose forge had shod most teams in the valley, harnessed his last strong mare to a flat cart and drove toward the old riverbank pits east of town, refusing to believe that every seep had failed at once. He had been broad and tireless through ordinary summers. His apron burned in pinprick stars from years at the anvil, and he had once told 2 younger men that iron taught patience because heat always returned if one waited. That day it did not. He dug in 3 locations, filled 1 barrel with muddy water, unfit for drinking, and turned the team home in the late afternoon. At the south bend, he climbed down to push the wheel through rutted dust, staggered once in the heat shimmer, and sank to one knee beside the cart tongue. Teamsters from the livery reached him within minutes, carried him into the wagon shade, and poured damp cloth water on his wrists and neck, but his breathing never steadied. He died before sunset, with his hammer still tied by thong to the cart rail. Because he had planned to work again at dawn, no one in Sage Hollow laughed that evening. The bell at Pastor Turner's church rang slow after dark, and each stroke traveled up to Shane's bench while she cleaned ladles and reset jars for morning draws. She wrote Daniel Crow on the mortality line of her ledger, not as a statistic but as record of cost, then marked all heavy labor households for extra broth by order of need rather than account standing. By July 24th, fever moved through 2 streets nearest the old pits where families had begun drinking from shallow, unboiled holes scraped into contaminated bank mud. Marta Bell was among them. She had kept house alone since her husband's death 3 winters earlier, took in mending to pay taxes on a narrow lot, and had refused line draws at first because she said others needed measured water more than she did. Neighbors found her weak at midday, kettle overturned on the stove, a cup of cloudy water beside the chair. Pastor Turner and Lucy Hale carried her to shade, then to Shane's cool room where temperatures were lower and flies could be kept off. Shane mixed boiled broth with vinegar and pinches of salt, gave it by spoon, and sat through the hottest hour counting intervals by wall clock, while Marta drifted in and out of speech, At dusk, Marta gripped Lucy's sleeve and asked whether rain had come. Lucy said not yet. Marta Bell died just before midnight with her mending basket under the cot, threaded needle still tucked in cloth as if tomorrow were certain. The second bell ringing was heard by every household, and after that, no one called ration rules harsh. On July 26th, with the porch thermometer at 103 by noon, and wind pushing dust in visible sheets down Main Street, Crowley's shelves began to show raw planks where full stock had once projected authority. First flour sold out, then sugar, then lamp oil. He raised prices twice in one day on remaining items and demanded cash for all but the oldest accounts. Yet coin could not purchase what wagons had not delivered. The line at his counter shortened not because need eased, but because inventory vanished. By evening, he stood behind empty bins that still carried neat hand labels from spring. The town that had treated his store as command center now treated it as a place to confirm absence. That same night, news reached the gate by lantern that little Thomas Hale had been lost to the combined burden of heat and distance. Ellen Hale had walked farther than advised 3 days running to assist at wash lines and then queue for late draws after others had finished, carrying Thomas each trip when his strength thinned. On the third return, she took shelter under a wagon awning near the edge of town. And by the time Lucy ran uphill for Shane and Pastor Turner, rode for the doctor from a mining camp 6 miles north, the outcome was already beyond remedy. The doctor arrived only to confirm what the family had endured. Thomas Hale died in his mother's arms before nightfall, too young to understand why grown men had spent 2 years arguing with a cistern instead of building one. The grief was not theatrical. It was quieter and harder than that. Ellen Hale did not wail. She sat beneath the awning after the church bell, one hand on the blanket over Thomas while Lucy stood near her with a water cup. She did not drink. Shane knelt once, adjusted the awning flap against dust, and told Ellen in a level voice, "You come to the gate at first light. You do not wait in line. Lucy will draw with me." Ellen nodded without looking up. By the morning of July 27th, desperation and humility reached the same point. Households arrived at Shane's gate not as scattered petitioners, but as a group with tags in hand and tools over shoulders, led by Pastor Turner, Lucy Hale, and 2 paces behind them in a coat gone gray with dust, Elias Crowley. Turner spoke first because his voice still carried trust in rooms where others had spent theirs. "We require instruction, not merely water. Our arrangements have failed. We ask for order under your rules." Crowley then removed his hat and held it against his chest. The gesture cost him visibly, but he made it in full view of the line. "I sought to purchase what should have been shared. I used influence where I should have used warning. My store cannot supply this town. Your cistern can. Tell us what labor is needed." Shane did not prolong the moment. She stepped to the chalkboard, wiped the old schedule clean, and wrote a new structure in large block letters: draw rotations by district, boiling stations by street, burial teams exempt from midday labor, child carriers assigned from strongest households, and daily ditch crews to widen catchment before any rain chance in August. Then she handed Crowley a slate and said, "You will record every draw at the gate from noon to dusk. No erasures. If you miss a line, the whole count fails." He accepted the slate without argument. Lucy Hale moved to Shane's side and asked in the plain tone of one worker to another, where to begin. Shane pointed to the wash basin and the stack of cloth. "Hands first, then tags, then teach the next child the same order." Lucy nodded and took position at the line head, her cracked pails now scrubbed and numbered. From that hour forward, the cistern ceased to be a private project and became the operating heart of Sage Hollow. Bucket brigades ran by a whistle at sunset. Broth kettles were rationed by ladle mark. The night watch kept count under lantern smoke and entered totals in Crowley's careful merchant script, each figure witnessed by 2 households before the board was reset. The heat did not break. The wind did not soften. Yet where the town had been a scatter of failing plans, it became a disciplined queue around one measured source. And measured source was enough to keep the living alive. Measured source was enough to keep the living alive. But only if discipline held when exhaustion began to blur judgment. So Shane widened the system again before the next noon heat. She opened the cool room by schedule, not by pleading, and moved stores in fixed sequence. Beans first, then squash, then salt pork, with vinegar and coarse salt reserved for broth and fever recovery. Crowley stood at the gate desk from noon to dusk with his slate and merchant pencil, reading each household tag aloud while Lucy Hale checked age marks and vessel size. When arguments rose, Shane did not answer the argument. She answered the number. 2 gallons, 1 1/2. Half ration for washing unless illness had been recorded at dawn. Every draw was witnessed by 2 households and entered twice, once on slate, once in ledger, because arithmetic was now the only form of mercy that could be trusted by all. On July the 29th, with afternoon temperature at 102 degrees and wind still carrying grit from the South Flats, she converted her shed into a teaching station and set 3 benches outside in shade made from wagon canvas. She demonstrated cloth filtration with boiled muslin, showed how to settle sediment in narrow neck jars, and timed rolling boil by pocket watch so families would not mistake steam for safety. She sent older children home with chalk instructions written on board scraps. Keep lids weighted. Dip with clean ladle only. Never return unused water to storage. The lessons spread faster than fear because they gave each household a task that could be completed before dark. By the first week of August, 47 homes had built covered barrel stands from scrap timber and stone, and Pastor Turner reported that evening, fever cases had begun to decline on the 2 streets nearest the old pits. 3 days later, a freight rider from Cheyenne finally arrived with delayed mail sacks and a single wagon of mixed goods that would have sold at ruinous price under ordinary panic. Crowley surprised the line by posting fixed emergency rates copied from Shane's gateboard and signed in his own hand. Nails were sold at prior spring cost. Jar lids were capped at 10 cents per dozen. Pipe washers were released from locked bins without account preference. Some men called it repentance, others called it necessity, but the outcome was material and immediate. Households that had wasted coin on painted pumps and decorative barrels now bought plain fittings, tight lids, and muslin bolts by measured length. In the same week, Crowley carried from his office the old inspection notice and Shane's signed receipt for the $9 fee, read both documents at the committee table, and struck the fee from town practice by unanimous vote. The paper that had once been used to isolate preparation became evidence in its defense. By August 11th, heat still reached 99 at noon, yet the town no longer moved as a scattered body. District draw rotations held. Burial teams had proper water allotments and were relieved at set hours. Elderly households received first light deliveries by paired volunteers trained at the gate. Shane posted one additional rule after 2 near mistakes with contaminated buckets. Any vessel seen uncovered in a dust wind would lose next draw slot and receive instruction before reinstatement. No one challenged the rule after seeing how quickly grit clouded standing water. Crowley enforced it without softness, and the authority he had once used to silence warning was redirected, at last, toward order. The reckoning did not arrive as a single speech. It came by footsteps over hard ground. Ranch wives who had once sent children with exact coin now came themselves with hammers and asked where to set roof gutters. The carpenter who had withdrawn hinge work in winter brought plain cedar and rebuilt the gate hinge at no charge. then stood aside while Lucy inspected the swing for full closure. The school teacher, who had called Cistern talk harmful, asked permission to copy Shane's ration tables onto classroom slates for arithmetic practice, and when permission was granted, children in Sage Hollow began learning fractions through water allotments rather than chalk puzzles divorced from consequence. The town was teaching itself to remember. On September 2nd, 1890, nearly 1 year from the church meeting where survey figures had been dismissed, Pastor Turner called an autumn gathering under the same roof, with all 307 surviving souls accounted for in the vestibule book. The number was spoken aloud before prayer, and each soul heard in that count the absence of Daniel Crow, Marta Bell, and Thomas Hale. No bell rang that evening. Silence performed that work. Crowley sat in the front row without vest chain or polished boots, coat brushed but permanently dust-stained at hem and cuff. When Turner opened the floor, Crowley rose and remained standing until the benches settled. "I called this work Preston's Folly," he said, voice roughened by weeks of gate duty and smoke from broth kettles. "I said a town did not kneel to a jar-keeper's fear. I mocked warning in this very room when I should have funded it. I overcharged for nails and iron when fair price might have increased readiness. I sold confidence because confidence was profitable. Then my own well failed, my shelves failed, and the order I claimed to protect failed with them. I was wrong in judgment and wrong in conduct. The record of that wrong sits in my own ledger and hers. I ask no easy pardon. I ask to remain in the labor." The confession did not dissolve the room. Others rose one by one and attached their names to specific harm. The deacon who had left Shane's proposal in a drawer stated that he had feared injuring business more than protecting households, and that fear had cost time that could not be purchased back. The committee clerk admitted he had signed inspection notices he knew were punitive. The carpenter acknowledged that he had refused work because credit pressure made obedience easier than integrity. Even those whose offenses were smaller named them plainly. Repeated ridicule on porches, withheld invitations that isolated labor, refusal to attend Sunday instruction until death forced humility. No one contested the facts because the facts had been kept in ink all along. When Ellen Hale stood, the room shifted forward as if bracing for a blow. She did not accuse. She held Thomas's hat in both hands and spoke with severe calm. "I listened when men said the creek would return. I delayed line draws because pride tells a mother she must not seem needy. My delay was mine, yet my delay was fed by voices that treated preparation as shame. If this town remembers my son, let it remember him in measurements, not in speeches." She sat before anyone could answer. Lucy Hale moved beside her and remained there until the final hymn. After the gathering, reckoning continued in action across weeks. Crowley reopened account books and canceled $312 in emergency interest charges incurred between June and August, entering each cancellation in red and posting the totals publicly. He allocated a full bay of his store to preservation goods at cost for 1 year, with scales and instructions hung at eye level. The committee established a water and stores board of 5 members, including Shane, Lucy, Pastor Turner, a ranch representative, and 1 seat rotating every spring so no single house could claim permanent authority. The survey sheets from 1888 and 1890, once waved away as odd-year inconvenience, were copied and bound into town records beside birth, death, and deed books. Physical evidence was no longer hidden in drawers. It became civic memory. Shane answered all this without triumph and without performance. She met the board at dawn on September 10th, spread her ledgers across the church table, and divided instruction into 2 obligations per household, 1 for storage and 1 for preservation. Storage obligations included lid construction, catchment cleaning, barrel elevation, and weekly inspection marks signed by 2 neighbors. Preservation obligations included one protein method, one vegetable method, and a salt inventory checked at month end. Families without tools were paired with families that had them. Families with labor shortage were assigned youth assistants through the school. "Forgiveness is smaller than this work," she said when Turner asked whether the town should draft an apology resolution. "I did not build for revenge, and I will not govern by resentment. But I will not call memory complete unless your children can run this system without me." She then taught in the manner her mother had taught her, with strict seasonal arithmetic and no indulgence for vagueness. She showed where seep loss had increased after each false thaw, and why 20 inches of wall had mattered when heat cracked thinner masonry elsewhere. She explained that thermal mass in earth and stone held near 55 degrees when lids stayed sealed, and that a cistern was not merely a hole, but a chain of habits. Clean cloth, counted dipper, posted schedule, verified ledger. She handed Crowley the old overcharge entry from 1888 and asked him to read it aloud beside his cancellation entries, not to humiliate him but to fix cause and consequence in one hearing. He read it. He did not lower his voice. Years later, travelers entering Sage Hollow from the South Road saw changes before they heard the town's name. Roof lines carried gutters pitched to communal ditches. Barrel stands sat shaded and numbered behind nearly every house. School slates by the church door listed weekly water depths beside spelling lessons. In dry years, planting plans were approved only after storage counts were posted. In wet years, the same rules held, because abundance no longer erased memory. Building, like Preston, became common praise for work that was plain, measured, and durable, and young couples took it as blessing when older hands said their cellar was laid in that manner. In 1898, when another hard summer struck the basin and nearby settlements sent riders seeking guidance, Sage Hollow did not close its gate. The town sent instructors with copied ledgers, measurement staffs, and lid templates cut to 3 standard barrel diameters. Lucy Hale, now a grown woman with the same steady voice she had carried at 12, led 2 of those teams herself and returned with notes on local soil variation, so methods could be adjusted rather than imposed. Crowley funded wagon freight for Lyman muslin at cost, signed by the board, and refused profit on emergency goods by standing rule. Pastor Turner died in 1901 and was buried above the creek line. At his service, the board read from the first water ledger before reading scripture, placing record and reverence in rightful sequence. The stone cistern still stands above Sage Hollow, cedar lid replaced twice, iron fittings renewed as needed, walls sound at 20 inches where Shane rebuilt them under laughter that turned in time to gratitude. The cool room remains in use each summer. The chalkboard has been remade many times, yet its columns are unchanged. Visitors read the carving on the lid brace, cut deep enough to survive weather and handling. Measure before hunger, store before praise. Measure before hunger, store before praise. The words were still fresh in cedar when Shane set a trestle table beside the gate on September the 4th, 1890, and laid out every remaining emergency item for public count, because inscription without inventory was only sentiment. Crowley stood at her left with the merchant scale, Lucy Hale at her right with chalk and slate, and households filed past by district while Pastor Turner read each line aloud in a voice built for hymns and hard facts. 11 jars beans unassigned, 6 jars squash, 2 crocks salt pork, 1/2 sack coarse salt, 3 jugs vinegar, 9 lengths clean muslin, 4 spare lid hinges, 1 box mixed nails, 2 gate pins, 1 broken washer lot for recut leather. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was dramatized. Families with the weakest stores received first transfer. Each handoff witnessed and entered twice. When the table was empty, Shane sent no one home. She moved the crowd uphill to the settling basin and made them open the system in reverse order, so every soul understood what had preserved them. Lucy lifted the intake grate and showed the trapped leaves and grit that would have soured the chamber if left in place. Two ranch sons shoveled the silt trap under Shane's direction and measured the removed depth against the cedar staff marks. Crowley, coat sleeves rolled and palms blistered, cleaned the spilled trench stones with a wire brush and set them back by grade. The children carried boiled cloths and learned to dry them on lines above dust height. By sundown, the cistern was not merely admired, it was maintained. On the 8th of September, 4 days after that count, the Water and Stores Board met at the church table with every document that had shaped the crisis spread under weighted candlesticks. The 1888 survey copy, the 1890 creek measurements, the inspection notice with red stamp, Shane's $9 receipt, Crowley's cancellation pages in red ink, and the gate ledgers from July and August. The committee clerk, who had once signed the punitive fee, dipped his pen and entered each item into the permanent register by title, date, and witness names. He paused at the line for the torn church notice from May, the one whose lower half had vanished where drawdown timelines had been listed, and after a long silence he wrote, "Original damaged before archive. Perpetrator never identified. Data reconstructed from Preston Ledger, and 2 corroborating copies." No one disputed the wording. No one claimed the act. The absence itself was preserved as part of the record. A week later, in the schoolhouse yard where arithmetic slates now carried ration columns, the children brought their household tags for recutting. Thomas Hale's tag lay among them, tin-worn smooth at the edges by handling. Ellen Hale stood by the fence rail, while Lucy punched a small mark beneath the number and handed it back, not for use at the line but for the memorial board the town had agreed to mount beside the church bell rope. Daniel Crow's hammer thong was nailed beneath his name. Marta Bell's mending needle, threaded and sealed behind glass, was placed beside hers. The board was plain pine. No ornament, only names and dates, and one line copied from Ellen's autumn words. Remember in measurements, not in speeches. By late October, when morning temperatures dropped to 29 degrees and smoke began to settle low in Sage Hollow at dusk, each household reported for its assigned inspection under the 2-task rule Shane had set. Storage first. Preservation second. At the Bell Widow lot, 2 neighbors demonstrated a new cedar lid weighted by stone and sealed with boiled pitch. At the livery bunkhouse, 6 laborers showed elevated barrels on rock piers and a posted boil chart by the pump. At Crowley Mercantile, the former display wall for painted pumps had been rebuilt into shelves of plain jars, muslin bolts, and spare washers at fixed rates, each price posted in large numerals with no hidden account clauses. When one ranch foreman tried to purchase the full washer crate in a single lot, Crowley refused and divided stock by household allotment. He did so in public, under his own sign, and took no exception for friends. On January the 12th, 1891, almost 1 year from the false Chinook that had misled the town, a rider from the territorial office arrived with a letter packet wrapped in oilcloth. The same survey clerk who had read the 1888 figures on the church steps now wrote from Cheyenne, requesting permission to copy Sage Hollow's storage ledgers for distribution to 3 settlements upstream where wells had begun to fail. The board gathered that evening by lamplight while snow hissed against the windows. Shane read the letter once, passed it to Lucy, then said, "Copies may be made. Original books remain here. Instruction must include maintenance schedules, not only dimensions." The clerk's request was entered as external correspondence number 7 in the new register, with outcome noted in full and no delay drawer this time. In March, 2 wagons came from Coldwater for instruction. Their leader asked first for measurements and costs. expecting perhaps a quick list that could be purchased and transported. Shane walked him to the silt trap before she showed him the main wall. "If you do not clean this each week," she said, tapping the trap lip with her staff, "your grand structure becomes a foul pit. Expensive failure and cheap failure are equal at that point." She charged no fee for the lesson. She required labor in exchange. The visitors spent the day clearing catchment ditches in Sage Hollow before taking copies home. Years passed in work rather than proclamation, and each season tested whether memory had truly entered habit. In June 1894, a wet spring tempted some families to delay lid repairs, and the board issued citations measured in labor hours, not money. 2 mornings trench cleaning for each missed inspection. In August 1896, freight delays struck again. This time, the store shelves thinned in order, not chaos, because reserve bins had been established at the church cellar with rotating stock counts each first Monday. The old decorative pumps, once sold as confidence, had long since been stripped for parts. Their iron handles became gate levers, hinge braces, and tool hooks across town. Costly ornaments turned into useful metal at last. The hardest proof came in July 1898 when heat climbed past 100 degrees for 6 consecutive days, and 2 nearby settlements sent riders before panic could harden into denial. Dusty Fork arrived first, 5 men and 1 woman with cracked barrels and a map marked in hurried pencil. They expected to meet Shane alone. Instead, they found Lucy Hale, now 20, standing beside the gate table with the same strict calm she had carried as a child. Shane watched from the basin wall while Lucy assigned them stations, 1 at the wash line, 1 at the tally slate, 2 at filtration, 2 at evening broth. "You will learn by doing," she told them. "This town was taught at great cost. We do not waste that tuition." The visitors stayed 8 days, copied the full maintenance cycle, and departed with templates cut to their barrel sizes and a written commitment to establish a rotating stores board before autumn. Elias Crowley did not seek ceremony for his part in those later years. He kept the noon gate on high heat days, even when arthritis swelled his knuckles and made pencil grip clumsy, and he trained younger clerks to post true freight invoices where all could read them. On the 10th anniversary of the crisis, he brought Shane a folded paper from his oldest ledger, the page where he had first written Preston's Folly, in a margin joke for his own amusement. He placed it on the table beside the current ration board and said, "This is the line I taught the town. I ask that it be kept with the records, so the beginning is not cleaned up to flatter the ending." Shane nodded once and gave the page to the clerk, who stitched it into the archive between the inspection notice and the first emergency draw sheet. By 1903, Sage Hollow's population stood at 341 souls, and every building permit required 2 signatures before approval, 1 for structural soundness, 1 for water plan. School children recited multiplication tables through jar counts. Newly married couples were given a starter ledger with columns already ruled. At funerals, households sent not only casseroles and flowers, but also 2 days of water chores to the grieving family, because the town had learned that mourning did not pause necessity. The cistern still stands above Sage Hollow. Its walls hold through heat and freeze. The silt trap is cleaned each 7th day in dry months. The cedar lid, replaced when needed, remains weighted and sealed. In the church archive, the survey sheets, receipts, overcharge entry, cancellation pages, and mortality board records are intact and indexed. Visitors can read the whole chain of warning, mockery, cost, labor, and change without a missing link hidden in a drawer. On summer evenings, when lines form for routine draws that no longer carry fear, children trace the carved instruction with their fingers and speak it aloud before they lift a bucket. Measure before hunger, store before praise.